That's good. Perfect. Hello. Hello. No. Not many people, but I kind of expected that. So first of all, just to see where we stand, who's using DSC ever? Who's played, like, at least played with it? Like, everyone, okay. So who's been using it quite a bit, like, almost, like, okay. Writing custom resources? They're usually good to know. Getting there. Like, maybe you're not committed yet, right? It's good. Who's been doing or thinking about doing it at scale, which is more than 10 servers? Yeah. Thinking about. I'm not saying doing that. It's a pain, right? And usually that stops you. So that's kind of what this talk is about, but at the same time, there's a lot of context. So who's been to the previous session by Ed from the DevOps group? No one was there? Oh, you were there? Yeah, I remember. Okay. I just stole a few slides from here because that was like a really good introduction. So whenever it goes online, the video, just go and watch it. There's a very good introduction to DevOps, and everything we kind of doing is related to it. So who's a developer in general? You all are. That was a trick question. You are some kind of developers. If you write PowerShell, you're some kind of developers. There's a lot of meaning to it, but you write code, and that's what I care about. And I think everyone agrees the less code you write, the easier it is to maintain it. So we'll see how that plays. So thank you first to all the sponsors. And thanks for the organizers. That's really cool. We started last year, and then it's carrying on. It's really getting bigger event, so that's a very good event. Really like it. And I know I'm the last one before the beers, so if I'm really rambling too much, just let me know. And if you have questions, obviously not shout, but let me know. Not you, by the way. Go ahead.
What are you buying?
Beers? Maybe to you, because it's your birthday, so yes. So one of the questions, and actually going back to your keynote, so there's something in the keynote that, yeah, there's production code and production code. Like, not everything needs to be perfect, and not everything needs to be, guidelines and things. And I'd like to ask you, especially not too many, why do we automate stuff? So shout, why do we automate stuff?
Consistency.
Yes.
Time saving.
Time saving.
Unit testing.
Do we do that for unit testing? No. Yes. So there's a hint. It's not just about to save time. And that's the key things. And this is also why the DevOps context is very important. It's not just to save time. And one of the key elements is finding, and this is exactly what the talk was about before, it's about the value you can tie from what you're doing and how it helps the business. And I will show two of these slides. You can see, like, I'm only doing IT, I'm only doing IT ops, but you're providing something to the company, otherwise you wouldn't be hired. Is it your time that you're just providing? That's extensively, yes, maybe it's your time, but because in your time you can do something. And this is what you need to understand is what's your role is about, and what value do you provide as a team, not only as an individual, and how you can relate that to the business. So it's not about people telling you what to do, it's you understanding what they expect, and then you can provide the solution for it, you can design it, and automation is part of it. But you were right when you say consistency, so we can say it's standardizing what you're doing. So it's more repeatable, it's a bit more scientific, it's not just, maybe I know how this service is configured. That's not the way you can run an IT service. And it's also to improve quality. This is why kind of the things you were saying, but that is not the ultimate goal. And there's a bit more to it. But that's actually coming from Steve Mirowski, because I had a chat not long ago, and it was actually earlier this week, I saw like a conversation he was having with some other peers, and then said, well, this wording is actually good. We've been focusing on saving time, but that's the wrong approach, because what do you do when you've saved time? Well, you save more time, yeah, but this is not the goal. There's a reason why you're trying to save time. So always get back to these principles. What are you trying to do? And at the same time, well, if we tell you everything about the environment we expect you to do, will you have anything to do after that? Yeah, because it's going to change. And we've seen, especially in the previous talks, we've seen that change is driving the companies and the business. The environment is changing. The competition is fierce. So you in the IT, within that organization, you're changing as well, and you need to adapt. And for that, you need to build the capacity for change. And I think that's very important. And I actually wrote a blog post just for that, because too often we focus on part of the problem, part of the solution, automating, but then we have lots of automation. And in the end, we need more automation engineers to manage the automation. And we create a new silo. We're not automating the task anymore. We're hiring people to maintain the automation that was meant to save the time. So we're missing something and we're not looking far ahead. We're just trying to automate to save time, but we're missing some of the points. So there's automation, saving time, but you need to remember the purpose, and you need to make sure that you're not short-sighted. So hierarchical data lookup, which I'm going to say HDL if I use that. Just, it's not really the goal, and it's not really the point. This is just a tools, technique, if you want, to manage your infrastructure. And this presentation is going to be about a module I used, which is just a copycat from what Pipette does, which is called Hiera, for that reason. And it's also a pattern that you see in all the configuration management tools. Pipette uses it, a similar approach. Ansible, that you probably saw in one of the videos, oh, maybe it wasn't, but Tron Hinderness last year, I think did a presentation which is partly on the roles and playbooks you can do in Ansible. This is the same principle, configuration data management. So it's a tool and technique to solve a specific challenge. What's very important here is it's not the goal, so it's very useful, maybe in your context. If you're trying to do configuration management, whether it's Ansible or something, the principle applies. Then the tools, which tools you're going to use depends on your context, depends on your environment. This was one of the slides from the DevOps group guy, Ed. He said, even if you're not customer-facing, you're providing a service within your organization. So you have some customer, and what the service you're doing is some kind of platform as a service. People don't really care about your environment and all the details of your IT structure, but they do care that in the morning, their workstation is going to work, their file server is going to work. You're providing a service, and that service is used within the business to create some value. So you're part of an assembly line, if you want, to create value. And you need to understand that context so then you know what really matters. And it's very hard because not many people are trained. Managers or us, we're not trained or driven to do this. We are told to do what to do, and we play the game. Don't do this. I've been there. It's a dark place to be because you don't know if you should spend time on X, on Y, or on Z. And the problem is at some point, they will tell you, well, you're too busy. Stop automating. You need to do this, this, and that. And then this is when we get the reaction, oh, we're too busy to automate. The other thing I found was interesting was about the communication and the data and the managing the data in a pipeline. I'm going to go in a bit more details. This is the slide from the DevOps group, and this is what helps you making the connection between the business and between the infrastructure. And the reason is it's high level enough so that it's easier to translate a story from we need to have a service that helps sharing files to these teams, to an actual change to an infrastructure to support AD groups changes, to support a new file share somewhere. So that helps you making the transition between the story of what the business needs and how you're going to change this into something that is code-related, actual work. So how does that fit into? There's like this is a view, if you want, of it's a diagram. So you've got the digital transformation, which is the big box, which there's some definitions, but if you want to understand roughly where we fit, you've got the digital transformation, and part of it is DevOps practices, movements, philosophy if you want. And then another practice, more specific, that we're talking about when we talk about DSC, configuration management, infrastructure as code. And then I go even deeper within this, which is the configuration data management. You missed your slides, that was just before. But that was a great introduction, thank you. So in configuration data management, we are already quite deep into some parts of problems we're trying to solve. We're not looking at all the organization, but it's another way to bridge the gap between the dev, the ops, and some other people. And by focusing on the data, it's easier to look at something that you can communicate with. So it's making infrastructure visible. And from that visibility, you can have the right stories to be able to translate to the business. You're making a change for the business, and that translates into something for your infrastructure as code. So actually, I took from their blogs, from the DevOps group blog, I took a few definitions. Sorry, it's a bit, I just had to shorten them a bit, but this is actually 2 blog posts, very interesting, that I'll send you the link to. Digital transformation, it's the constant alignment of an organization's process and models to leverage latest digital technologies. And then DevOps within this, it's a working culture that breaks down the traditional silos within IT, and it's either throughout the lifecycle. It's the product vs project mindset. Very, very important, but not enough people know about it. Do search when you go home, project vs product mindset. That's very important because you have a lifecycle. It's not because you have worked on something and you automated it that the product is finished, you don't have to deal with it. You have to maintain it. And this is something like if you don't have this in mind when you design your automation, it's going to cost you eventually. And this is the vicious cycle of you need automation silo to manage your automation. An infrastructure as code is just a set of practices to enable iterative management of work to infrastructure, applying concepts developed from software management. So code management, as an example, everyone's familiar with pipelines? Yeah? Do you have infrastructure pipelines? You have one? You're the only one? Like this is the first way of DevOps. To get back to your slides, I should have taken that one as well. So you should create a delivery system. And when you've got that delivery system, you will be able to get more and more feedback. And this is how you can build trust into your delivery system. And from that feedback, you build trust and you get faster and faster. It's not about going crazy and just releasing stuff you don't know what's going to happen. It's about being confident that when you do a release of a small batch, you can get feedback early enough so if it breaks, if it fails fast, but it's a non-event. Automation, yes, so automation and infrastructure as code, there's a few concepts that really I don't have time to cover, but it's quite important. So declaration of state instead of imperative transforms. Who's doing a lot of automation, like deployment, infrastructure deployment, and it's not using DSC, Chef, Pipette, these kind of things. They just wrote PowerShell scripts. Who's doing that? You're doing that? So the problem is you hit when you do just imperative scripting, at some point you're going to reach the point where if you want to understand what the infrastructure is, you need to read your script, which is iterative. Do this, then do this, then do that, or maybe do this, or maybe do that. When you focus to a state, you define the state you expect, and the system converge to that state. And that's much easier to manage when you start to have a bigger environment. When you've got 2,000 nodes, you don't want, or more, you don't want to go and look for every single line to see what's going on. You want to have a snapshot, high-level snapshot, what's going on in there. And you don't want to see what the process you went through. You want to say if it converged to the state that you intended it to be. And that's exactly what DSC is about, is you define the state, the systems converge to it, and then tells you if it reached it or not, if it's compliant or not. And when you think about the mental model, it's much easier to see, am I in the state I expect? Yes, no. And then if no, then you try to dig and find out. But when you look at a big infrastructure, it's easier to deal with this in this way than looking at individual script lines. Oh, I forgot to. At the same time, when you think about a declaration of the intended state, what you intend to be, it's easier for the human to communicate. So it's making the work visible. There's a very great book which is Applied to a Different Environment by Dominica de Grandis. Very nice book to making work visible. That helps you to manage work. Very recommend that one. And these principles actually apply to your infrastructure. How can you communicate, manage changes to something you can visibly and you can't see? It's like, yes, he knows. So he's managing it because it's fresh in his memory. What about communicating around it? It's very hard. If it's visible, much easier. And if the goal is agility, so you want to be able to respond to change because the business is responding to change. There's a loop, and actually this is, I don't have time to go into deeper, but do some research on the OODA loop by John Boyd. That was an US Army jet fighter pilot. And it's the perception, cognition, action loop where you feel the system by your perception, you think, you orient, you try to find out what you need to do next, and then you act. You're actually making the change. And what he found is to be a better fighter pilot, you need to have this loop faster than your enemies. So the quicker you can react and you can adapt to the situation, because it's an ever-changing situation, you can react to it faster. And it's the same, to some extent, it's the same for infrastructure. You don't want to be starting working on something which is a huge batch of changes to be told, oh, we don't need that anymore. That happened to me many times. Like, we have this very important project. We gathered the spec for 12 months. You need to deliver it. And 3 months later, well, actually, we don't need it because we need these other things. So the quicker and the smaller the batch is, and if you have a good system where the perception is very easy to grasp, like what is going on in my environment, you can just have this loop being faster and faster, and the feedback is very important. And this is why a pipeline model is very practical, because it gives you a feedback loop, and the delivery system is automated. Who's read the, what's it called, the build pipeline model by Steve Morawski and Michael Green? And this is a white paper from Microsoft explaining you the concepts about a pipeline model. And this is for ops, for guys like you. It's about going from Git, looking at source code, and how to change your systems from there. Really, really recommend that. Everyone should read it. You read it? You liked it? Yeah. So all your changes, all your infrastructure should be driven by that model. It's only 50 pages or so. It's quite easy to read. I'm glad you're here. Config management is quite hard. You see there's not that many people, and it's quite niche kind of area. I'll get into code very shortly, but understand where it fits, and then at some point you're going to get to that problem, and you're going to be able to say, oh, maybe I can apply this principle, and then use those principles into your environment. It's under-documented, so especially if you're coming from DSC, you looked at the docs on Microsoft, and exactly, you laugh, because you've got, yeah, use this, do that. And then everyone's problem, if you look at the DSC forums, are always the same, but Microsoft is not really responding to those questions, because they're focusing on the Azure solution, I would say, and not on just using DSC. So the DSC as a platform kind of things they've been saying for a while. And it's hard to see the value at first, but I've been in that specific area for a while, and the more you do it, the more you understand the value, and then the better the decision you're making. So I'm going to try to bootstrap you to understand the problems, and if you ever face it, you say, oh, this is why. So the plan is challenge to scale to DSC. That's going to be, what is DSC? I'm going to go quicker because I believe most of you have a good understanding of DSC. And then HDL. The Datum module I wrote is the same kind of things as what Pipette is doing with Hiera, which is a very good reference and very well documented. And then DSC and configuration data lookups, you'll see what it is. There's a model which Pipette created, well, someone using Pipette created, actually a guy from the UK, which is called role and profiles. So I just readapted it to say roles and configuration, and I'm going to explain you why. So DSC at the simplest is DSC configurations, which is one DSC file, you know, when you have your configuration code construct. using some DSC resources to which you apply some DSC configuration data, which most of the time when you start, you put that into the same file. Then you have something a bit more advanced, which is the DSC composite resources. I'm going to go very quickly in this, but it's the same. It's very similar to a DSC resource. But it's a mix between the DSC resource and the DSC configurations with parameters. Who's been using DSC composite resource? OK, quite a few. It's good. Who's been using DSC partial configurations? Partials? No one? You ditched them, haven't you? Yes. OK, good. You tried, and it fell. OK, so that's good. I'm going to go fast on this one.
Ran away screaming.
Yes, exactly. And then DSC, again, at the simplest, you've got the MOF compilation, which is creating the actual file that's going to be sent from your pull server or from your push server to the actual node that you need to configure, and the LCM enacting the MOF. I am not going to focus on the principle of the LCM, and go very quickly on the MOF compilation. I assume if you played with it, there's not much to it. You just don't want to edit the MOF themselves, ever. You don't want MOF to start with, because it's, and never mind. But yeah, so what does a configuration look like? Very simple. Everyone wrote something like this? Easy. It's just a configuration. You have in one file, the PS1 file, you're using a DSC resource, and you have the configuration data in there. You call this to create the MOF, and which is relating to that configuration. And that's a very simple configuration that's going to apply to a node, which is, it's not specified, so it's going to be localhost, because I don't specify which node it's going to apply to. But that's how simple it can be, and that just generates a MOF. Nothing too difficult so far. Then you want to have the same thing, but you want to use configuration data, because sometimes the file is changing, or you want to be able to edit it somewhere different. So you would specify some data. You will extract the data from some information, and in that case, we're using a file, which is a PSD1, and that is the documented way by Microsoft. You want data, you want to separate data from your code. That's a good practice. Then you should do this, and that doesn't scale at all. But you use the data here, and you reuse it into your resource. So far, so good? Everyone's done that before? Yes? Good. So that's familiar. This is where the problem starts, but we'll get to this. And actually, Missy Janusko wrote a very good article about the best config data layout. Like when you use DSC out of the box, I really, really recommend looking at this article. I will send the link. You will just search for Missy Janusko config data layout. She explained what are the best practices and how is it possible to organize your code in PSD1 for an environment. The problem is this is the best way to do it out of the box, and that's not enough. This is why you're having problems with it. So this is how the file looks like when you have my configurations 2.psd1. This is a configuration file, PSD1, and you see that you can relate this to the file configurations we've seen for the DSC resource. Very similar. Jason Helmick, actually, your best friend. Jason Helmick actually, at the last summit, did a presentation on advanced configuration data, and he's showing in much more details than I'm doing now the problems you will have with managing configuration data. I'm just trying to go quickly over the principles and then show you the solutions more than the problems. Compiling the MOF. You all know that. Compiling a MOF, simple. I think I don't have to go through this. I will do it anyway in a bit, slightly different. So I'm going to skip and go a bit more with why separating the DSL, the DSC DSL, so the DSC domain-specific language, from the data. Well, at some point, in the DSL, even if it's declarative, you will use some logic, because you will separate, say, if this node is of that role, then apply this resource. Otherwise, so you have code in there, you have logic. And this is what we try to avoid, is having some code that you need to go through to see exactly what's happening. You want to have a good visibility, high overview of what's your infrastructure. So if you look at the code, you still need to go through all the codes to see roughly what it is. And it's not the kind of high overview you want to have from your system. And the other reason is, once you trust the code, you should be able to change the data. You should have some validation of the data, but you should trust the code enough so then you can change the data. If it's one domain name or another domain name, if it works with contesto.com, then it should work with another one. So you should be, at least, if it fails, it should fail late, maybe early, or at least you know that with a given set of information, it worked. So separate it, separates the concerns, and you can build trust into your code first, and then trust into your data second. So you separate your pipeline into, I'm validating the code in small units because it's more manageable when you create a module, DSC resource, DSC configurations, and then you make sure that you validate your infrastructure specific, which is your organization's implementation of those modules. And as I said, you need higher level of view when you scale up. You don't want to know, well, this is, you want to know roughly, well, I have all those cattles, I have all those type of roles, and they're all unique, except, well, that one's got an override. That one's got, it's a bit more specific. You like this role, but I changed it a bit because I want to test a setting. And that's the kind of view you want to have. Another problem with DSC, I don't know if you faced it. When you use data like this, whether it's in the file, a different file, a PSD one, or whether it's in the same file, that works as well. You use the data directly. But what happens when you have this construct and you remove the contents? No, it still has this entry into your file, and that means this is not null because it doesn't exist in there. And in your morph, you're going to have contents equal null instead of not setting this. So in some case, it doesn't matter. It depends how the resource is written. In some other case, that means make sure this file exists and make sure the content is null, more or less. So the problem is sometimes you don't understand what's going on because your code seems all right, but because you missed one data, it just completely changed it. So what do we do in, so DSC doesn't support splatting. Everyone knows what splatting is? Yeah? So DSC doesn't support splatting. So if you want to support this case, you need to have if. If data.contents is not null or is not specified, then I need to have another case than this one. Else, I can use this. And then your DSC configuration just starts getting much bigger because some resources have many, many options, and you don't want to set them null, so that's getting a real pain. And that's, I think, one of the most moaned about lack of feature, I would say, of DSC. Also, when you have, and that's the problem with the approach that Missy explained. This is how you would define like basic configuration data. And you can split the non-node data. In this example, this is domain controller data. And then you can specify the environment, the domain name for this environment, the DN, database path, and these kind of things. Very similar, very, very common, right? What happens when I want to have another one for a test environment? And this is why many people don't have a test environment. It is very hard to be able to reproduce exactly the same while just changing some bit of data. I want to reuse this because that doesn't change, but I want to have something else here. So if you use this way of changing the data, then you need to have another entry, which is data test, and you probably need to copy-paste everything here and putting in there. And then your DSC configuration is going to have to use, well, if it's in the test environment, use DC data test. Else, use DC data. And you already have some logic to it. So it's not very flexible. There's no override possible. You can't say, well, I just want to override these 2 bits if it's in the test environment. And that's a big drawback when you start scaling DSC, because you have a lot of logic where you shouldn't. You should just want to, I just want to override that bit because it's that environment, or because it's in this location or not that location. And then when you start creating your DSC configurations, you have big problems like This is the where true. It's just because this is where usually you put your role-specific information. If this node is in like roles equal or $node.roles equal DC, then do this file. The problem is you're already doing logic in the configuration. That means it's already fixed. You already have some logic in that configuration. You won't be able to use it in different settings. Let's say from one company to another company, it's probably not going to work because they will have different role names. Or then you need to extract the role names, and that's another kind of worms. Very difficult. And then there's other questions we don't have solved, or not everyone has solved it in different ways, I would say. It's how to structure the data. So the key of the data that you're feeding into DSC is what is specific to your environment most of the time. How you compose and assign those roles. You have to build this logic yourself, and then if you want to change another, you need to change the code. And then most of the time, if you start doing this and you have many, many lines of code, many, many nodes, you have many, many roles, and then you have to build this hash table, because otherwise you have a single file of 40 megs. Not really manageable. Where is that line again? And then you need to scroll down and find out. I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to get hungry otherwise. If you haven't tried, yeah, go ahead.
Just as a general aside, when I was doing PowerShell in action, Bruce's comment on partial configurations. When I was doing PowerShell in action with Bruce Pipette from the PowerShell team, his comment on partial configurations was don't.
That answers it. Perfect. So yeah, don't start on that path. So some people will have different approach to it. Some people will say, oh, but it works very well for me. I say, if it works for you, fine. If you're successful, fine. If you haven't tried that path, just don't. It's not worth the risk. And very quickly, the risk is, so that what it's doing and why it's bad, one of the reasons it's bad, it's taking different MOF files and merging them together on the node, and then at runtime, and then it applies it. So you don't really know upfront how it merges it. You should obviously build trust into how it works, but it's kind of up in the air. So if you have one configuration which is setting your power settings in one way, and another one setting it in another way, you won't necessarily know the conflicts. They're just going to be switching every time, up and down, every time you apply the config. So you will catch it, maybe, if you have a good pipeline, but that's going to be very annoying, and you have a risk that you don't need to take. And then you have multiple sources of truth, and then it is a really bad practice. Some people try to solve, like, this team is going to work on that, and this other team is going to work on the security bit. If you don't know what your security team is doing, and you're trying to do your things your own way, you're going to have merging problem. Merge early, so then you don't have this problem. And that's why partials is usually used to have different teams managing different things. Very bad practice. There's other ways to do it. And you need to merge when you test. Don't merge on the node when you do the configurations. And then this is, again, the same kind of things. Just don't take the risk. Partial, don't take the risk. If you haven't started, at least that path. So a quick summary of the issues with DSC we usually find. Null values and the lack of splatting, very annoying. Lack of flexibility in static values. Mapping configuration data values forces a structure. That means when you use a configuration data from a file, usually it's kind of very specific. And you realize that if you have a different project and then something changes, you need to change the configuration code. Very, very hard. And composition of a configuration bricks on the temptation of partials, yeah. It's a temptation, just don't go there. So choose an approach, pseudo-splatting, I will explain it, and then the things that go with Datum. So the pseudo-splatting is, well, actually, there's a way to splat if you use a little function like this. What it's doing is just creating a script block in a very dirty way, and then just creating the resource, invoking with some parameters that we specified here, which is the properties that you want, and invoking it. Simple, quick, dirty, but it works. What it does is then you can import that script. This is the function, just a quick way. it still kind of looks the same. Ooh, indentation is not good. It still looks the same, but now you can see that it's actually a proper hash table there. That means I can now use splatting. It's a pseudo-splatting. So it's not exactly splatting, but it's pseudo-splatting. And that gives you more or less the same benefits. There's a few things. So this is a simplified version, just for the information. Then there's a big issue about context in the script block when you run it. So in one of the projects I'm going to show you, I'm going to link you to the actual function file, and you can reuse it in your projects if you want. So how to map data to resource. So now you can use splatting, and because we already define pretty much all information in your data, why do you need to write every resources you're going to use? What you can do is, using the data, and for each of this information, actually that's a mistake, never mind, because resources, oh no, resources is here, so for each resources, I can just do a for each and use this. Very dirty, again I had to compress that code a bit, but the idea is you don't have to specify all the data. Now you can just specify all the configurations. Now you can just say, well, I want some file resource, I want something else. This is not dynamic enough, but it's just building up to what's really dynamic approach. But then you can just use the data, change the data. If you want to remove content, then you can use this and you don't have to change the code. You change the data only. Easy. If you want to have null, you just change this to null. And then you can also specify null if you really want to for the file content. You with me? Would that be helpful? So, we've seen, I've just built up the principles. Now we're going to see exactly what the data lookups is about. And the idea is you start with very generic information. This is your cattle, you want the roles. Everyone believes they have a type of role until they actually try to do infrastructure as code. Then they realize they have snowflakes everywhere, because someone changed something some way, and then, oh yeah, that's an exception because of X, Y, and Z. But if you don't make that visible, you're not going to see it. And the problem is if you just use configuration data, like the DC data we've seen, it's very, very hard because it's not flexible at all. So you want to have a hierarchy. Well, I want the role which gives me the default for that role. And then I want to have some layers of change. Well, in this environment between test and dev, I will have a different domain because I don't want them mixed together. So I want to be able to specify an override for my environment. And if I'm in test, I want to be contoso.com, not mycompany.com. And then you may have something about the location. Well, if it's in that location or that other location, or maybe it's in Azure, I want to have a different type of override. I maybe want to have different type of VMs. I want to have different disk size. And then sometimes you want something very specific to Node, maybe just because you try to have something specific. And the problem is this is a snowflake you're creating, but you know about it, it's visible, so you can manage it. And that's a specific one. So you need to be able to have these layers of override. And this should not be fixed. This depends on your environment, what works for you. And you can see it in this way. I have some data, but I want to look up the value for software packages. So for this node, my server 01, I want to know what software package is. So is it defined in the node? Do you have a snowflake defined there? Or is it in the location? Is it in the environment? Or is it just generic to the role? And then the lookup is going to look through the hierarchy to find out where is it defined. And that means from a very, you can have your very generic roles, and you can have some specific overrides depending on the environment or whatever your layers you have. And this hierarchy usually represents your constraints in your environment, in your company. So the module I'm talking about is called Datum, and everyone's going to moan about YAML, and I'm not using PSD1. There's a few reasons for that, and I'm going to get to it. The first reason is PSD1 actually doesn't support ordering. It's a not ordered hash table, which is when you're looking at the code and the data it gets, and you're looking at the definition you have, it's actually two different things. So with YAML, we can have ordering, which is better. And then YAML is very terse. So it's a pain because it really, you need to respect the indentation. But a human eye can read that very quickly. If you have JSON, it's a bit more of a pain. Even if it's well-written JSON, sometimes it's a bit more of a pain. That one, you have no curly brackets, double quotes that you don't need to. Slightly easier to do. And remember that the infrastructure, you need to change it. So the quicker you understand what's going on, the quicker you're going to know what to change, and you will be able to effect that change. And think about when you do a pull request on a YAML file, it's very easy to see what's changed and very easy to see the impacts. So that's one of the reasons I use YAML most of the time. A lot of people say like, oh, it's awful, we need to use something else, JSON, PSD1, we don't care. And then after 2 weeks, like, actually, it's quite easy. When you have big files or a lot of files, it's much easier to read and to work with. So the idea is, in all those files, I store the data, and I define my hierarchy in the Datum YAML configuration file. And that is defining the resolution precedence, which is the order of the hierarchy. And this is loading the data as similar to a PowerShell provider, similar. The PowerShell provider is actually the file provider in that case, and then you're just accessing the data directly as an object. So when you do $nodes, well, dollar whatever, this is $datum.allNodes, dot the name of the node, that actually gives you the information from that file. It's just a way to work around this. I'm going to show you that in a minute. And then you define your server, as you did before. I just put the Datum YAML configuration here so you remember how it's organized. And this is the basic things you would do. That's the server one. It's got the role assigned to it, which is my role. The location is London. Environment is dev. And in that role, so my role.yaml, so in that role, I specified some software packages. Get, I've just specified that this has been specified in role, and this has been specified in the PowerShell and VS Code. All of those have been specified in here. And I have my resolution precedence here. And the idea now is I have an override for Kuala Lumpur. This is where I live at the moment. And you can see that I override this information in my hierarchy. You see that the most specific is all nodes, the least specific is the roles, and in between we have the location. So because in that server we specify the location London, it won't get this one. But if I change the location, it will automatically, sorry, I should not do this. It should automatically use, sorry, next one, it should automatically override to Kuala Lumpur. So this is how to do the lookup. You create the structure, simple. You just say, hey, look at the YAML definition. And from there, it's going to load automatically all the folders and YAML files that you've got. YAML, it supports YAML, PSD1, or JSON. Just use YAML. You'll thank me later. Much later, but you'll thank me later. I just load the node just because it's easier to work with, and then I can do a lookup for that node. And that gives me what I expect, which is defined in the role. If I change the location to Kuala Lumpur, then the lookup now is going to be overridden by Kuala Lumpur, but the data is specified in the Kuala Lumpur location. So this is what a lookup is about. You get the data at a path, which is the path here is software packages. You can go deeper, obviously, but this is the root path if you want. And it will look through the hierarchy, finding where is the data relevant based on the precedence of overrides I've got in my hierarchy. Make sense? So, what time is it? 15, all right. I'm probably going to go back to the demo when I open the thing. Any questions so far? No? Good? You lost? Not yet. Traditional configurations, you have a PSD1 here with the node. You have resources. You create a configuration file. You've got the resource here, and you've got the data. So what's happening is You're linking or you're referencing the resource from this module, here into your configuration. You're linking your role here into what I said earlier when you have the where, okay? And you have non-node data that now you're referencing here. Okay, that's the traditional model. The approach that Pipette had is to create another layer on a different kind of assembly system, which looks like this. So that's adapted from Roles and Profiles by Craig Dunn, which is the way you do it because it's the best approach for Pipette things. So you have the node definition in your YAML file. You still have the same resource, the same module with the same resource. Usually you create a configuration, which in that case it's a DSC composite resource, which is the same keyword configuration on the same thing, you just have parameters to it. And this configuration is going to reference the file. And in the role definition, you will say, a bit like I showed you when I had my for each loop, you say, well, use that configuration, files on folder, that's the name here, and use that configuration for the role. Then obviously we link the role here to the role definition. So for that, no one's going to apply this role. So you have a view of the role here. And then you're going to use the definition of the parameters to feed them directly into the config. So this configuration needs parameters, and the parameters they're going to use is what you define here. And it can be a configuration, but it can be also just a DSC resource. It works exactly the same way. A DSC resource and a DSC composite resource is very similar. The difference is where it's executed. I'm not going to get too much into the details. But that's the roles and configuration model. You define your node, the node defines the role, and you link it to your role definition. And from there, you can specify the parameters to it. And then it's going to be using a composite resource or DSC resource directly that finally are going to be referencing this. And one of the reasons to do this is you decouple the code, the data, the role assignment, and it's much more flexible. And I'm not representing all the layers that you have between the node and the role definition. So you can specify overrides of just the data, or you can specify overrides on the configurations. Another thing I haven't said, and I'm not going to go too deep for now, is I showed you the override system. But through your hierarchy, you can also merge things together. So if you have a layer which is defaults for everything everywhere in my company, you can merge that up with everything. A bit like group policy things, but text-based. And that means the collaboration system is much easier than when you have to change the GPO by doing right-click, GPO, and then you have those weird rules. So the magic is the same as the for each I was explaining earlier. You look up the configuration keys that I just showed you, and then you just do the same pseudo-splatting trick, and then you can just look up the properties of that configuration name. So if the configuration is file and folders, you look up for the parameters for that node's context, and then you just splat the properties to the file and folders. It's a lot to take in. So I'll get back to this. I'm going to go on the demo very quickly. Questions? Fire up. If you have any. So, no questions?
How long did you spend in a cave working this out?
That's a very good question. I'm not going to answer that one. A long time. So, yeah. Steve, no, actually, I did that mainly last year, but I started earlier. So in 2014, at the PS Summit, Steve Murawski actually wrote something kind of similar to this, a bit more simple, but no one understood what he was doing. And there's a video still on PS Summit. And at some point I was digging, and then he told me, oh yeah, I did a presentation on this. So I had to pause and look what he was doing and understand the project, which is on GitHub. And I understood it. I started to write it before I realized, well, actually it's lacking some flexibility. And then I found out about Pipette, about Ansible, about Chef, especially he was working with Chef at the moment. And I realized, well, they all have the same model. And I learned a lot about the others by trying to redo my own. So there's a couple of projects that are meant to be a pipeline, a DSC pipeline. And the good one is a DSC workshop that we did at PSConfig last year with Raymond Andre and Jan Hendrik Peters. These guys are doing the automated lab project, maybe you've seen. And the idea is, let me just do this. Nope, yeah. And the idea is you can get started and see this in action just by running this if you want. So in this case, I want to get into the DSC workshop, DSC sample, and there's a build.ps1, and I want to resolve the dependency automatically. And what it's going to do is going to fetch the dependency in is, which means the modules to build it, the DSC resources, and the DSC composite resource or configurations. The problem is composite resource is a very bad name. No one understands why this is the name, but this is how they named it. It's actually very useful to do configurations. And so just running this, what's going to happen is going to be looking at the code, pulling everything in this from the gallery, and then compiling them off straight away. And it compiles them off, and it compiles everything you need for a DSC. So from there, you can just push that to a pull server, and then you can start configuring your node. And that's a very good way. We wanted to do this, so it's a very good way, easy way to get started. And I am just running as my user, and that's very simple. Just compiles them off and do the works for you. And I'm going to show you a few things about that. Let me open this. So it's going to work a while. In the meantime, I'm going to show you another project, which is here. Actually, that's the same project. And this is what's going to happen in a minute. It creates the mof in there. You have the modules it pulled. You have the metamof, which is how you configure the LCM, which is already configured. And everything is coming from the data you set. And that's a good. And the configuration data is that bit. And you have a very simple hierarchy here. You only have roles and all nodes. But if you look at the datum configuration, you have a bit more things. So this is the hierarchy, and you can see you can have absolute path like this, or you can have a variable path based on the node data you give when you do the lookup. And then this is where you can have much more configurations, where you can merge, when you can merge different, like some configurations across your hierarchy. So this has a lot of examples on approach to how to use Datum. And if you look at the roles, you can organize them directly in folders, which is quite convenient when you have a big configuration, or you can have a single file to define it, like the baseline. It tells you, well, I want the composite resource security base, Windows features, and I want these parameters for those configurations. So from DSC, which is already a DSL, we abstract this away into code, but when you get a node which is using that role, you can already see what should be in there. Make sense? Is it useful? Yeah? Any question? No? Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but it's not difficult. So let's get back here. So what happened here, let me scroll back up. It tells you everything it does, because that's a demo project if you want. But you will see a bit more details. Come on, here we go. So here you see it goes through each file, and then for each file it tells you which composite, which configurations it applies to it. And then if there's an error, then it's going to bring that up to you. So if you use DSC, if you use DSC before, you will know that sometimes it fails at the very end, and you don't really know why, because the error is very deep under the $error stream. So by doing this, we just bring it up a bit earlier, so then you know what failed, and sometimes we can tell you why. And Datum in the end is just some variables in there, and you can explore it by just going there. This is my files, and if I change the files straight away, it's just going to automatically refresh if you want this data. Otherwise, it's going to cache it. So if I go to file server, and then I have tab completions, and it's directly telling me my configuration in there. So you have a programmatic way to look at the data which is in files. Okay. And let's get no, another one. Dev. Another way, so this is another project also on GitHub, which is DSC InfraSample. For me, it's a slightly different approach, but it's exactly the same principle. Again, you have the configuration data, you have a big hierarchy, and this is the resolution precedence, and that also shows you many different types, if you want, of merges, and you have deep merge, you have deep tuple merge, you can be very specific. So if you look at software packages, you see that I'm merging based on a subkey, but I'm making sure that the tuple keys is the name on the version. So then if I have the same package defined twice, if the name on the version is the same, then it's not going to create a new one. But if, for instance, you also have installation arguments, it's going to merge that installation argument. So you can go very deep into the details of what you have. And then you're going to tell me, yeah, well, but in the end, it's very hard to find out what you're actually doing. And this is why there's something similar to the RSOP in group objects, in GPOs. You can have a resultant set of policies, so then you can find out in one big YAML file what is the settings you have for your node based on your hierarchy. And that, I think there's one here that may be compiled. DSC file 0. You see the name. And this is why ordering also is quite interesting, because then you can keep the ordering, and then you have everything that's been compiled based on the hierarchy you have. And that means when you got two releases of the same MOF, you have first the data. You can do a diff between what you did before and what you have now. And you can do that against your all estate, against your dev and your dev and prod environment. And then you can see everything which is not the same in the configuration based on your data. And soon, at some point, you're also going to see where this override is coming from, because I already have a way to get the data, it's just not performant enough to be released into that project. Good? Questions? Yes?
Another one. Can you use Datum outside the scope of DSC?
Yes, that's a very good question. So DSC is just the tool in your pipeline, which is at the right. If you try to use DSC to set up your Active Directory environment, good luck. If you have 1,000 objects and you wait for this to run, it's going to take ages. But the principle is the same. You want to have a quick interface that tells you what's going on, and you want to apply it with your delivery system, the first way of DevOps, and get feedback early enough. So yes, definitely that would be the way to go, especially for AD, that would be a good point. Yeah?
Just want anything other than files, i.e. databases?
So the way it works, it's a provider model. So there's an easy way to do this. And there's two things you can do. One is making links. And for example, when you have credentials, you don't want to use credentials directly into your file. So what I do is I link the credentials to my secret server. So whenever I'm compiling, it automatically retrieves the credential from secret server or Key Vault or whatever. So there's different options. And otherwise, for this, you can build your one for a SQL database, for instance. Or you can have a mix between one provider in SQL and another provider in something else. I believe I'm being kicked out. Any more questions? I'm done, no rest, it's okay. Any more questions?
Yeah, the one thing that I'm a little bit confused on is the composites. So previously, like DSC, it had this big configuration. Do you shift that then, and then you put the bulk of that in the composite resources?
Yeah.
And then Datum uses the composites.
So the mainly documented way is to use one big configuration .ps1 file. And there's actually a good way to document in a simplistic way, but what you should be doing is creating small bricks of composite and actually I believe they've updated maybe within the last month the documentation around it. And Azure is actually changing the way they're working, so then use more composite, and they provide more composite. So definitely, yes, you create small bricks, Lego bricks, and then you're going to compose them together. If you look at that project, you will find different composite examples, and you can see how we use it.
Okay, and then your pseudo splat and stuff does the clever stuff as far as dynamically allocating.
Yeah. Yeah, it just say, hey, I want to use that composite. I want to take this data, send it as parameter, do the work for me. All good? Thank you.